a 33-kilometer gap. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is just 33 kilometers wide, about the distance from central London to Heathrow Airport. Two shipping lanes, 3 kilometers across, running in opposite directions. And through that gap flows close to a fifth of all the oil on Earth. Almost every barrel burned in Japan, South Korea, India, and China passes through here. The industrial engine of Asia, queuing through a channel you could drive across in 20 minutes. It wasn't always like this. For most of history, the Gulf was a backwater. Then, in the mid-1960s, shipbuilders built tankers so enormous they could haul crude across whole oceans for almost nothing a barrel. And overnight, the Gulf's reserves were reachable by anyone, anywhere. Trade routes formed, refineries rose, and the modern world wired itself to one narrow channel. Everyone knew the risk, but the ships kept moving, and everyone told themselves no one would ever be reckless enough to close it. In February 2026, that comfort died. After U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iran, the strait effectively shut. Nearly 20 million barrels a day, a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade, froze overnight. Markets convulsed. Asian factories started rationing. Some stranded tankers tried the long way, around the southern tip of Africa. But the Cape of Good Hope adds nearly 4,000 nautical miles to every voyage. And across the fleet, that detour burned $40 to $50 million a week. Oil that sat near $65 a barrel before the war shot past $100. And it exposed one brutal flaw. The world had hung its entire energy system on a single point of failure and done almost nothing about it. That's finally changing. Gulf governments have committed to pipelines, rail corridors, and new ports worth around $300 billion. A bid to end the Hormuz problem for good. And it starts with an escape route Saudi Arabia buried in the sand more than 4 decades ago. One whose purpose the world is only now beginning to understand. Project 1, Saudi Arabia's Petroline. Picture 1981. Tankers are burning in the Gulf. The Iran-Iraq war is grinding on. And Saudi Arabia makes a decision that will look like genius decades later. For $2.5 billion, the kingdom lays a dual pipe system across the width of the Arabian Peninsula. A way out for Saudi oil with nothing to do with Hormuz. It runs 1,200 kilometers, from the Abqaiq processing complex in the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Built to carry under 2 million barrels a day, it's expanded to 5 million by 1992. Enough to move the bulk of the kingdom's exports, running underground beyond the reach of anything short of a ground invasion. They call it the Petroline, and for 40 years, it mostly sits there. The reason is money. Saudi Arabia shipped most of its crude through Gulf Coast terminals, bigger loading, closer to the fields, wired straight into the tanker routes to Asia. Yanbu handled a sliver, mostly for Europe and the Mediterranean. For years, people wondered why a pipeline built to carry the entire export load ran at less than half capacity. In September 2019, the Petroline earned its keep. Iranian-backed Houthi drones hit Abqaiq and briefly knocked 5.7 million barrels a day offline. One of the biggest sudden supply shocks in history. Aramco converted parallel natural gas liquids lines to carry crude, pushing the emergency ceiling to 7 million barrels a day. This year, it became one of the most consequential infrastructure decisions of the decade. When the strait closed in 2026, Yanbu, a modest port handling fewer than 800,000 barrels a day that February, tripled its output in barely a week, full capacity by mid-March, exports near 2.5 million barrels a day. The pipeline was finally doing what it was built for. And then it hit a wall. The Petroline can push 7 million barrels a day. Yanbu's 2 terminals can only load about 4.5 million. Oil was arriving faster than ships could carry it away. A 3 million barrel gap, bleeding losses reported in the hundreds of millions of dollars a day. Quick thing before we go deeper. This race, every pipeline, every port, every workaround, is happening right now. And the map is redrawing itself week by week. If you want to follow where the world's oil actually goes when its most important waterway slams shut, subscribe and stick with us. Now, back to Saudi Arabia, because the Petroline was never their only bet. Because here's the maddening part. Saudi Arabia spent 4 decades and billions building this bypass, upgraded it after 2019, ramped it to full capacity in 9 days, and still hit that wall. The Petroline covers roughly 80 to 85% of the kingdom's export capacity without ever touching the strait. Sounds like a win, but the other 15 to 20%, plus the port limits, leaves a gap nothing can close. And it wasn't even safe. By mid-March, Iran was reportedly launching waves of drones at the eastern province oil infrastructure Abqaiq depends on. The pipeline runs underground. The fields feeding it do not. In a war this big, nothing sits fully out of reach. So, Saudi Arabia has a second card. The Saudi Land Bridge, a 1,500-kilometer rail corridor first floated in 2004, linking Jeddah on the Red Sea to Dammam and Jubail on the Gulf through Riyadh. The idea is beautiful. Ships from Asia unload at Dammam, cross the kingdom by rail in under 10 hours, and reload at Jeddah for Europe, dodging both Hormuz and the Red Sea at once. It's the only project here that solves for container shipping, not just crude. The design contract went to a Spanish firm in April 2026, with completion targeted for 2034. The catch: after 20 years of planning, not 1 kilometer of new mainline track has been laid. For now, it's a promise, not a route, which is exactly why Saudi Arabia isn't the only one building. Project 2. The UAE's race to Fujairah. Nobody has more riding on this than the UAE. Since the war began, more than $120 billion has evaporated from the Dubai and Abu Dhabi stock exchanges. Dubai International Airport, the busiest passenger hub on the planet, suspended operations after Iranian strikes near the Jebel Ali port area. Emirates and Etihad grounded their fleets, tens of thousands of flights gone. A tourism sector worth nearly $70 billion in 2025 stopped overnight. But the UAE was never just an oil state. It spent 20 years becoming a financial hub, a bridge between East and West. And the war hit every pillar at once. But underneath, the oil problem never went away. The UAE pumps around 3 million barrels a day. Before the war, nearly all of it left through Hormuz. Then, a bet made a decade earlier paid off. In March 2008, work began on a 380-kilometer pipeline from the Habshan fields in Abu Dhabi's interior out to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, the far side of the country, facing open ocean beyond Iran's reach. Designed by Worley Parsons, built by a Chinese firm, it was meant to cost $3.3 billion and open in 2009. The financial crisis dragged it to 2012. $1 billion over budget, 3 years late. For years it looked like an expensive answer to a problem that never showed up. Nobody's laughing now. Since the war began, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline has run flat out, moving 1.5 million barrels a day to Fujairah and out to open water, skipping Hormuz entirely. For the UAE, it's the line between functioning and total paralysis. But it was never big enough. At 1.5 million barrels, it carries only about half the country's output, and the other half has always had one way out, through the Gulf. That gap is why a second pipeline was already planned before the war, which the war turned into an emergency. The new West East pipeline had been under construction for months when the strait shut. Abu Dhabi's leadership made it a national priority, accelerating every phase at once. Following a similar route, it's designed to carry 4 million barrels a day, more than the entire output of the UAE. Combined with the existing line, that's over 5.5 million barrels a day of bypass capacity, enough to move everything the country pumps without touching the strait. As of May 2026, it was about half built, targeting 2027. But finishing a mega project inside a live war is its own problem. Fujairah has already been hit. Iran-linked attacks in April forced temporary halts to loadings, and tankers leaving the port now switch off their trackers to avoid being hunted at sea. The place the UAE is betting its energy future on sites beyond the strait, but not beyond the reach of the war. Project 3. Iran's broken escape hatch. The third bypass belongs, of all countries, to Iran. And the irony is almost too much. For 40 years, the threat of closing the strait was Tehran's single best card. Every time tensions spiked, Iran reminded the world it sat beside a choke point it could slam shut. But there was always a catch. Iran's own oil left through Hormuz, too. Karg Island, which handles around 90% of Iranian crude exports, sits deep inside the Gulf. close the strait, and you strangle every rival in the region, while cutting off your own main source of revenue. That's why the threat got made over and over and never happened. So in 2019, Iran set out to fix it. A $2 billion pipeline, 1,000 kilometers long, from the Gore terminal in Fujairah province to a brand new export facility at Jask, a port east of the strait on the Gulf of Oman, outside the choke point. The logic was clean. Once it ran, Iran could export without Hormuz, and the threat to close it would finally have real teeth. President Rouhani inaugurated the project in July 2021, declaring it complete in his final days in office, despite warnings that it wasn't finished and that opening it early risked damaging the infrastructure. He opened it anyway. The warnings were right. When the cameras left, the reality at Jask was far uglier than the announcement. Of the 20 storage tanks the terminal needed, only 4 worked. Of the 3 offshore moorings, only 1. That single mooring loaded around 300,000 barrels a day onto medium-range tankers, under a third of the pipeline's stated capacity, serving short hops to the Indian subcontinent instead of the global markets it was supposed to unlock. And it got worse. Between October 2024 and April 2025, satellite tracking picked up nothing at the Jask mooring, but oil slicks leaking from the equipment itself. The escape hatch built to make Iran immune to a Hormuz closure was leaking crude into the Gulf of Oman while sitting idle. All 20 tanks were finally finished in mid-2025, 4 years late, but the pipeline was still running at a fraction of its design. Then February 2026 arrived, Iran blockaded the strait, and the bypass built for this exact moment got its test. Iran exports around 1.5 million barrels a day. Jask can handle less than 20% of that. The rest is stranded. With Karg Island cut off and Jask barely breathing, Iran is bleeding from the wound it opened itself. Project 4, Iraq's last resort. The projects so far cover maybe half the oil the war has stranded. The rest falls to countries with almost no answer. And the 4th is the boldest attempt to build one from nothing. Iraq pumped 4.3 million barrels a day before the war. By mid-March 2026, that had collapsed to 1.4 million, exports near zero. Southern Iraq, where most of the country's oil comes from, has no bypass at all. The Basra terminals that can move over 3 million barrels a day sit inside the Gulf, and every barrel has always left through Hormuz. A nation sitting on the world's 5th largest proven reserves suddenly had nowhere to send them. Iraq has one northern pipeline, the Kirkuk-Ceyhan line, 970 kilometers to Turkey's Mediterranean coast, rated at 1.6 million barrels a day. But it's been effectively shut since 2023 after a dispute over pipeline agreements, and even running, it only ever moved about 200,000 barrels a day. So, the answer Iraq is reaching for is the Basra-Haditha pipeline, a new route hauling southern crude westward, eventually linking to outlets in Turkey, Syria, and Jordan. In April 2026, Prime Minister al-Sudani put his signature to $1.5 billion for it. Early flows possible by late 2026 or early 2027. Full capacity above 2 million barrels a day. Enough on paper to change everything. But building pipelines in Iraq, a country that spent decades fighting sabotage, militia politics, and its own divisions, has a long history of running late and over budget. And then there's Kuwait, the starkest warning of all. It pumped around 2 million barrels a day before the war, every barrel through Hormuz, with no pipeline alternative, no bypass, no plan before February 2026. When the strait closed, Kuwait's export industry didn't slow down, it stopped. The state oil company suspended its obligations, and by late April, warned it couldn't meet its contracts even if Hormuz reopened. Stranded production had already filled every storage tank in the country. Saudi Arabia and the UAE built partial answers. Iran built a broken one. Iraq is scrambling to revive one. Kuwait had nothing, and now survives on swap deals and its neighbors' export corridors. The problem no pipeline can solve. But here's what none of these 4 projects can fix. Every one of them moves crude oil. There's one kind of energy no pipeline can rescue. Maybe the biggest problem of all. Qatar is the world's 2nd largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and it is completely dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. There's no substitute pipeline for LNG. No bypass route. The gas has to be supercooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius, loaded onto specialized tankers and shipped. And the only way those tankers reach open water is through Hormuz. After drone strikes hit the Ras Laffan complex in early March, Qatar Energy suspended its delivery obligations to buyers across Europe and Asia at once. A second wave of missile strikes days later tore into 2 production trains, knocking out a big chunk of Qatar's LNG export capacity, with repairs estimated at 3 to 5 years. In a trading room watching the numbers move, one energy analyst put it bluntly: the effects could eventually eclipse, in depth and scope, Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Europe had spent 3 years pivoting away from Russian gas, leaning hard on Qatari LNG to do it. Prices across Europe and Asia surged in the first weeks to their highest in years. For Qatar, there's no Cape of Good Hope detour. The gas can't get out of the Gulf in the first place. No pipelines, no land corridors, no plan B. The closure isn't a disruption. It's a total shutdown, and the damage doesn't stop at energy. The Gulf accounts for a huge share of the world's seaborne urea exports, the fertilizer behind much of the world's food, and Ras Laffan is one of the largest single-site urea producers on Earth. When it went dark, both stopped together, right in the spring planting window. Farmers who couldn't get fertilizer at any price didn't plant. Harvests that don't happen in 2026 become food shortages in 2027. Unlike oil, the world never built a strategic reserve for everything else that moves through Hormuz. The verdict. So, where does all this leave the race to escape Hormuz? The IEA estimates the Saudi and Emirati pipelines combined can redirect a bit over 5 million barrels a day outside the strait. Before the war, Hormuz carried 20 million. That's a 15 million barrel hole in world oil supply every day. And Gulf officials have described the wider damage to CNBC as a trust gap that may never fully heal. Under the current scenario, the closure has put around $3.57 trillion of global GDP at risk. No new infrastructure absorbs a loss on that scale. And that's the hard truth under all 4 projects. Everyone was sized for a short disruption, not a permanent one. Fully replacing what the Strait moves would mean new pipelines from every Gulf producer to every coast, LNG terminals on the Gulf of Oman, and rail corridors threading through countries that have spent decades at each other's throats. That's not a project. It's rewiring how the world sources its energy, measured not in years, but in decades. The roughly $290 billion now committed across the Gulf is a start. It is not an answer. The Strait will reopen eventually, and when it does, the world may face an entirely new economic map, one where the old rules of trade no longer apply. So, here's the question. Which of these 4 projects has a real shot at rivaling Hormuz? And can this problem ever truly be solved, or will the search for an answer reshape global trade itself? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to watch this race unfold, pipeline by pipeline, crisis by crisis, subscribe and come with us.